Hi, my beautiful and loyal family. Welcome back to the heart of your home, Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty wrap every woman in a tenderness that heals, a strength that never breaks, and a grace that turns every scar into a story of victory. May your hidden battles be met with divine comfort, your quiet prayers be answered in perfect time, and your weary heart find rest in places you never expected. You are the breath of kindness in a tired world, the warmth that steadies every home, and the miracle that reminds us love still lives. May your steps be guided gently, your days rise brighter, and your spirit stay surrounded by peace that nothing can steal. My precious family, don't go silent tonight. Your voice, your presence, your love keeps this family glowing. A like is a seed of hope. A comment is a circle of unity. If your heart carries love, like this video. If your spirit walks in faith, comment, "I'm with Mr. Peter." The screaming started before Michael Simmons could process what he was seeing. Two girls, identical, their faces twisted in raw terror, burst through the resort's glass doors like twin hurricanes, their voices desperate and primal, cutting through the cocktail party's pleasant murmur of investor small talk and clinking champagne glasses like shattered crystal across marble. "Help! Someone please help us! Our mum is being beaten in the parking lot!" Michael dropped his champagne flute without conscious thought. Expensive French crystal exploded in a starburst pattern across imported Italian marble as he ran toward the exit, his $1,000 handmade shoes crunching over spreading shards with each desperate stride, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard his chest physically ached. Other guests followed in a confused stampede, women in evening gowns stumbling dangerously in stiletto heels, men in designer suits shouting questions over each other that nobody could answer. Security guards were already sprinting toward the parking lot entrance, their urgent voices shouting coordinates into crackling radios with practiced efficiency. But Michael reached the oil-stained asphalt first, his lungs burning from sudden exertion, his mind already racing through liability concerns and crisis management protocols, even as adrenaline flooded his system and narrowed his vision. Then he saw her standing there in the harsh sodium lights, and every single rational thought evaporated from his mind like morning mist. The woman on the ground wasn't a victim cowering or crying for help. She was fighting back with a controlled ferocity that stopped Michael cold, literally rooting his expensive shoes to the asphalt. She had a man easily twice her size pinned brutally against a silver Mercedes, her forearm pressed across his thick throat with the kind of precise pressure that suggested extensive self-defense training, knee driving repeatedly into his ribs, hard enough to make him wheeze and gasp. Blood streamed from her split lip in a dark rivulet, painting her chin and throat crimson in the harsh parking lot lights, but her dark eyes blazed with something far beyond physical pain, pure, focused, absolutely controlled rage that seemed to crackle in the night air like visible electricity. The drunk investor she'd cornered was whimpering now like a beaten dog, all his earlier drunken aggression completely evaporated and replaced by genuine fear of this woman who'd turned his assault into his nightmare. "You put your hands on me without permission," she hissed at him, her voice low and venomous despite the violence of the moment, each word precisely enunciated. "And you actually thought I'd just smile and take it quietly because you have money and connections? I built myself from absolutely nothing. You think I'm afraid of you?" Then she looked up from her attacker, her eyes scanning the growing crowd of shocked onlookers. She saw Michael standing there frozen among them, and every single ounce of fire in her dark eyes turned instantly to ice, so cold it made the warm night air feel like winter. "Johanna," Michael whispered, the name he hadn't spoken aloud in years, suddenly filling his mouth like broken glass. She released the whimpering investor like he was contaminated with something lethal, stepping back smoothly as uniformed security guards rushed forward to restrain the man. Her twin daughters ran immediately to her side with protective synchronization, and that's when Michael truly saw them with devastating recognition: Aurora and Luna, their names embroidered on conference badges hanging from lanyards. They had his eyes, that specific shade of hazel that looked almost gold in certain light, a color he'd inherited from his grandmother. His jawline, sharp and defined even in their young faces. His widow's peak, that distinctive V-shape at the forehead. They were his daughters, undeniably, unmistakably, devastatingly, his own flesh and blood. "Ma'am, we need to call the police immediately," a security guard said, with professional concern, reaching tentatively for Johanna's arm to steady her. She jerked away with violence that made the guard stumble backward. "Don't touch me without my permission. I'm perfectly fine." "You're bleeding significantly," Michael heard himself say, his voice strangled as he moved closer, hand extending automatically toward the cut on her lip. "Please, let me help. Stay away from me." Her voice could have frozen entire oceans solid. Each word was precise and sharp as a surgical scalpel. Paramedics arrived within minutes with their equipment cases and practiced calm. Johanna allowed them to examine her injuries only because Aurora insisted with a fierceness that reminded Michael painfully of himself at that age. Michael stood completely helpless, watching this woman he'd known intimately for one night years ago command the chaos like a general on a battlefield already won. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit worth more than his first car, professional and powerful, despite bloodstaining her expensive collar. Her natural hair was styled in elegant locks that framed a face he'd never forgotten, not in all these years of deliberately trying not to think about her. She wasn't the vulnerable woman seeking shelter from a storm anymore, the one who'd trembled in his arms. She was a force of nature herself now, and she needed shelter from nothing. "Sir, do you personally know this woman?" A police officer appeared at Michael's elbow, pen poised over a notepad, eyes sharp and assessing. "Can you provide any relevant information?" Yes. Michael's throat closed completely around inadequate words. What could he possibly say? "We spent one intense night together and I never looked for her again. She's the mother of children I didn't know existed until 5 minutes ago. Tell your daughters, their mother will be perfectly fine." Johanna's voice cut through all the surrounding commotion like a blade, sharp as surgical steel, deliberately loud enough to carry across the parking lot. She looked directly at Michael as paramedics cleaned blood from her face with sterile gauze. "I've survived significantly worse than this pathetic assault, and I've survived significantly worse than you ever were to me." The twins heard every single word. Aurora, he could tell them apart now. Aurora had a small scar on her chin from some childhood accident he'd never know about, turned to face him directly with such pure, concentrated hatred burning in eyes so like his own that Michael physically stepped backward. "She told us about you," Aurora said, her young voice shaking with barely contained emotion, vibrating beneath a thin veneer of control. "The man who promised forever and disappeared by morning like a ghost. The cautionary tale." Michael's entire world tilted sideways. "She actually told you about me? Why wouldn't she tell us?" Luna's voice was quieter but infinitely more devastating, gentle and disappointed in a way that cut deeper than Aurora's rage. "We asked about our father when we were old enough to understand most people have two parents. She said you were a cautionary tale about trusting beautiful words from men who don't mean their promises." Johanna stood gracefully, despite the paramedics' protests about hospital evaluation, waving them off with dismissal that brooked no argument. "We're leaving immediately." "Ma'am, you really should go to the hospital for a complete examination." "I said we're leaving." She took her daughter's hands firmly, one on each side in a formation they'd clearly practiced, and Michael saw her conference badge more clearly. Dr. Johanna Carolina, Principal Architect, Carolina and Associates Environmental Design. Keynote Speaker, Doctor, Principal, Keynote. She'd built an empire from nothing while raising his children completely alone. As she walked past Michael with her daughters flanking her like an honor guard, she paused for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but long enough for her expensive perfume to reach him, something sophisticated that made his chest ache with recognition. "I saw your resort was hosting the Sustainable Development Conference." I specifically requested to be keynote speaker here at this specific location. I've been tracking your development projects for years, Michael, systematically gathering evidence and waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to strike. Tomorrow morning at 9, I'm presenting detailed documentation explaining exactly why your resort expansion project violates every environmental protection standard that actually matters. She smiled then, cold and precise and deeply satisfied. I didn't stumble into you by accident or coincidence. I've been planning this specific confrontation for a very long time, and tomorrow I'm going to take everything you built and prove it was constructed entirely on sand and lies. She walked away into the darkness beyond the parking lot lights, her daughters flanking her like bodyguards protecting someone precious, and Michael stood alone in the parking lot, surrounded by shattered glass and shattered assumptions, understanding with perfect clarity that the woman he'd spent years deliberately trying to forget had spent those exact same years preparing methodically to systematically destroy him. And she had his daughters already trained and fighting beside her, already taught to see him as the enemy he'd proven himself to be. The resort manager appeared at his elbow, face pale with concern. "Mr. Simmons, should we call our lawyers? That woman just assaulted a guest." "No," Michael said quietly, his voice hollow. "That woman defended herself from assault, and tomorrow morning she's going to destroy everything I've built." He looked at the blood still visible on the asphalt where Johanna had stood. "She has every right to do it." He walked back inside, past confused guests and concerned staff members, straight to his private office. Sat in the darkness, staring at nothing. Tomorrow Johanna would expose his environmental violations publicly. His daughters hated him with justified fury. The woman he'd never stopped thinking about had become powerful enough to ruin him completely. And the worst part, he deserved every bit of what was coming. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Built Herself. The conference room held 300 people packed into every available seat, and every single one sat in absolute silence, watching Dr. Johanna Carolina systematically dismantle Michael Simmons's entire business model with surgical precision. The Simmons Resort Expansion Project promises significant economic growth and substantial job creation for this coastal community, Johanna said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the vast space without any hint of strain, commanding attention the way great speakers do without appearing to try. What it actually delivers in reality is environmental catastrophe dressed up in attractive marketing language and glossy brochures. Their environmental impact study claims minimal disruption to coastal ecosystems. I have comprehensive documentation proving they systematically falsified survey data, deliberately underreported wildlife displacement by over 60%, and strategically scheduled environmental assessments during specific seasons when endangered sea turtle species were migratory and therefore conveniently absent from the study area entirely. Michael sat slouched in the back row, watching his professional reputation crumble in real time, like a building in slow-motion collapse. She had detailed charts projected on massive screens, each one more damning than the last, satellite imagery showing progressive coastal erosion patterns, video testimony from respected marine biologists who'd been pressured to modify their findings, internal emails, his own emails, discussing how to minimize environmental concerns for maximum profit. She'd spent years building this case with infinite patience, but something twisted uncomfortably in Michael's gut that wasn't just fear of exposure. It was recognition of truth he'd been avoiding. Over the past 6 months, he'd been having serious doubts about his business practices, waking suddenly at 3 in the morning thinking obsessively about the marshlands his last project had destroyed, seeing in his mind how his environmental consultant had been too eager to minimize legitimate concerns for timeline and budget. He'd told himself repeatedly it was just business, just necessary compromise every successful developer had to make. But lately, when he looked at the coastline from his corner office window, he saw damage instead of progress. He'd been about to order an independent environmental review of this very project, had actually drafted the email to his board requesting it. revised it multiple times, never sent it, because admitting doubt felt like admitting his father had been right to cut corners, that Michael had become exactly the kind of morally compromised businessman he'd sworn he'd never become. He'd almost done the right thing, almost. Now Johanna was doing the review for him, publicly and devastatingly, and he couldn't even argue with her findings because he'd suspected most of them himself during those sleepless nights. But this isn't just about one resort development, Johanna continued with relentless precision. This is about a systematic pattern of behavior. Simmons Development Corporation has manipulated environmental data across multiple major projects over several years. I have documented evidence of similar falsification in development spanning 3 different states and impacting thousands of acres of sensitive ecosystem. I'm not here to ask you politely to reject their expansion proposal. I'm here to inform you that I've already submitted this comprehensive evidence to federal regulatory agencies. The official investigation begins Monday morning. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Investors shouted panicked questions over each other. Reporters rushed toward the front like a stampede, cameras flashing like lightning. Michael's phone literally vibrated off the table from incoming messages, his legal team demanding conference calls, his board wanting emergency meetings, business partners asking if they were exposed, everyone demanding to know if this was true, if their investments were about to evaporate. It was all true. Every single word. And he'd suspected most of it himself. Michael couldn't breathe properly. The walls pressed inward claustrophobically, air thinning. He pushed through the crowd with elbows and desperation, needing escape, needing space to understand how completely he'd underestimated this woman who'd once told him her dreams while rain hammered windows of an abandoned beach house. In the hallway outside, he leaned heavily against the wall, legs suddenly unreliable beneath him. Memories crashed over him like the hurricane that had brought them together years ago, vivid and painful and unwelcome. That night felt like it had happened to a completely different person in a different lifetime. They'd both sought shelter in an abandoned beach house during the hurricane, 2 strangers running from different disasters. His father had just died unexpectedly from a massive heart attack, leaving Michael to inherit a family company collapsing under massive debt and financial scandal. The empire his father had built was revealed to be mostly smoke and mirrors and creative accounting. Johanna had been escaping a family that told her she'd never amount to anything, that her dreams of becoming an architect were impractical fantasies for a black girl from a poor neighborhood, taking a solitary trip to prove to herself that she was more than their limiting expectations. They'd talked until dawn broke golden over the ocean, sharing truths they'd never told anyone. She told him about her vision for architecture that worked with nature instead of dominating it. He'd shared his genuine terror of inheriting a broken empire, of failing the hundreds of employees who depended on his family's company, of becoming exactly the kind of man his father had been, underneath the successful facade, hollow and desperate and fundamentally dishonest. When the storm finally passed and sunlight streamed through broken shutters, they'd made love like it was the only honest thing in a world built entirely on lies. "Find me," she'd whispered afterward, fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "Promise you'll find me after you handle your family emergency." "I promise," he'd said, meaning it completely in that perfect moment. "I'll come back. 1 week, maybe 2 at most. I just need to handle some immediate crisis business, then I'm coming straight back here to find you. I swear it." But then his mother had called at 3 in the morning on day 4, her voice barely coherent, and everything collapsed at once. She'd taken pills. Not enough to kill her immediately, but enough to terrify him and require emergency intervention. She was in the hospital having her stomach pumped, screaming that she couldn't face the shame of financial ruin, that she wanted to die with her husband. The family attorney called exactly 1 hour later with worse news. The company had 72 hours before complete collapse. Creditors demanding immediate payment. Employees' paychecks would bounce. Federal investigators asking pointed questions about his father's creative accounting. Michael spent those first 3 days in absolute chaos. Hospital visits between his mother's suicide watch, lawyers explaining the terrifying complexity of the financial disaster, banks refusing extensions, employees crying in his office about losing their homes. He called every hotel in Johanna's beach town between crisis meetings, left his number with a dozen businesses, even hired a local investigator to search for a woman named Johanna who'd been staying during the hurricane. But she'd already checked out. No forwarding address, just Johanna, and a beach town wasn't enough information. On day 4, his mother tried again, seriously this time, with real intention to die. Michael found her unconscious in the bathroom, surrounded by empty pill bottles. Another hospital, another stomach pumping, psychiatric hold. The company's creditors filed emergency motions. Employees with children faced eviction. He was 26 years old, trying to hold together an empire built on lies, while his mother actively wanted to die, and a woman named Johanna was somewhere out there, and he couldn't find her, and everything was burning down simultaneously. He kept trying despite the chaos. Week 2, he hired another investigator with more resources. Week 3, he drove back to the beach town himself during a rare break, searching desperately. But by then, shame had started its insidious work, whispering during sleepless nights. What would he even say to her if he found her now? "Sorry, my life exploded and I'm probably going to lose everything anyway." He started convincing himself she was better off without him, that she'd moved on to better people, that approaching her now would just drag her into his disaster. Week 6. His mother was finally released from psychiatric care on heavy medication. The company stabilized barely, hanging by a thread. Michael was working 20-hour days, sleeping on his office couch, and the investigator reported back, "No Johanna, matching the description anywhere. Trail gone completely cold." Shame became a wall he couldn't climb. Months passed in a blur of crisis management. He told himself he'd search again once things truly stabilized. But things never fully stabilized, and the guilt of not finding her became easier to bury deep than the terror of actually succeeding and having to explain why it took so long. So he stopped trying altogether and built his empire on the foundation of that failure, working himself to exhaustion so he wouldn't have to think about the woman he'd promised forever and then lost. "She tried to find you too, you know." Michael turned sharply. Aurora stood behind him in the empty hallway, arms crossed, expression completely unreadable. "What are you talking about?" "Our mother. She tried to find you." Aurora's voice was flat, deliberately stripped of emotion. "She went back to that beach house 3 separate times over 2 months. Left her contact information with every business in that entire town. Hotels, restaurants, the post office, gas stations. She even hired someone to search for a man named Michael who'd been dealing with a family business crisis and a recent death." Michael's chest constricted painfully. "I didn't know any of that. I had moved to another state entirely. I was trying to save the company from complete bankruptcy. She was pregnant with us." Luna appeared beside her sister, voice softer but infinitely more painful. "She wanted to tell you about it. She thought maybe you'd want to know you were going to be a father to twin girls. I would have—" Michael started desperately, but Aurora cut him off with a sharp gesture. "But then she found a newspaper article about you," Aurora continued, voice growing harder. "6 months after that night, business section, you were being interviewed about your big comeback, your successful turnaround of a failing company. The journalist asked if you had any regrets about the difficult period after your father's death." Luna picked up the story seamlessly, eyes never leaving Michael's face. "You said, and I quote this exactly because Mom kept the article in a box for years. Sometimes you have to leave the past behind completely to focus on building the future. You can't build something genuinely new while you're still mourning what's gone and what failed." Michael remembered that interview with sudden, vivid clarity. Remembered the journalist was attractive and subtly flirting. Remembered trying to sound confident and forward-thinking. Remembered not thinking about Johanna at all because he'd locked that night away in a mental box labeled "Beautiful Mistakes from a Chaotic Time That's Over Now." "She was standing outside your office building when she read that article on her phone," Luna said, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 7 months pregnant with twins. High-risk pregnancy. Scared and alone and still hopeful that maybe you'd want to know about us. She watched you through the office window for a long time, laughing with your colleagues, celebrating some business victory with champagne. She realized that approaching you would make us feel like obligations, Aurora finished, jaw tight with controlled rage. Like the past you were trying to leave behind completely, like burdens that would ruin your shiny new successful future. So she walked away from your building that day, Luna said quietly. And she decided right there on that street, standing pregnant and alone, that her daughters would never know a father who saw them as mistakes to be left behind. She decided right then that we'd be enough for each other, that we didn't need you. The twins looked at each other with that silent communication only twins share, then back at Michael with identical expressions of judgment. "Tomorrow morning first thing," Aurora said with absolute finality, "you're going to find something very interesting waiting on your desk." They walked away in perfect synchronization, leaving Michael alone in the hallway with crushing understanding. Johanna hadn't just survived his absence, she'd transformed it into fuel, into the kind of deep strength and determination that could bring down entire corporate empires. And she'd raised their daughters to be just as fierce, just as brilliant, just as completely unforgiving of weakness and betrayal. Chapter 3. The Daughters He Never Knew. The document waiting on Michael's desk the next morning was 47 pages long, printed on heavy legal stock paper, bound professionally with a clear cover and metal spiral binding. The title page read in precise legal formatting: Itemized account of paternal financial obligation, 18 years of child support, medical expenses, educational costs, and compensatory damages for emotional distress and abandonment, comprehensively prepared by Aurora Simmons and Luna Simmons for official delivery to Michael Simmons, biological father. Michael's hands physically shook as he turned pages. His vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall where anyone might see. Every single expense was meticulously documented with receipts, dates, context, and supporting documentation attached. Obstetric care, including multiple high-risk pregnancy specialists. Emergency cesarean section performed at significant cost when labor became complicated. Neonatal intensive care for premature twins, born 5 weeks early with various complications. Formula, because Johanna's traumatized body couldn't produce enough milk for 2 babies while recovering from major surgery. Diapers, thousands upon thousands over the years. Childcare expenses while Johanna completed her graduate degree. School supplies for every year, medical insurance premiums climbing higher, clothes constantly replaced as children grew, food carefully calculated, tutoring when Aurora struggled with reading, professional art supplies when Luna showed talent, robotics equipment when Aurora became passionate about technology, everything imaginable, documented with forensic thoroughness. The total at the bottom, including interest calculated at standard legal rates compounded annually, was absolutely staggering, well over $500,000 accumulated over 18 years. But it wasn't the enormous number that destroyed Michael emotionally. It wasn't the massive financial obligation that made his chest feel like it was caving inward. It was the notes written carefully in the margins throughout the document in 2 completely different hands. Aurora's precise architectural block letters and Luna's flowing artistic script. Beside the hospital bill for Johanna's emergency delivery, Aurora had written, "Mom almost died during delivery from massive hemorrhaging. Lost so much blood they had to give her 4 complete units of transfusion just to keep her alive. Luna stopped breathing 3 separate times in the first hour and required aggressive resuscitation. I had severely underdeveloped lungs and spent 6 full weeks on supplemental oxygen. Mum went through all of this completely alone, with no partner, no family nearby, no support system except overworked hospital social workers." Beside the extensive childcare expenses for their first 3 years, Luna had written, "Mom worked exhausting night shifts at an architectural drafting firm while simultaneously taking demanding graduate classes during the day. She slept approximately 4 hours per night for 3 consecutive years straight. We have photographs from birthday parties during this period where you can see how utterly exhausted she was, dark circles like bruises, losing weight from stress, but she's still smiling in every picture because she never wanted us to feel like burdens." Beside the simple notation for a used winter coat purchased from a thrift store for $15, Aurora's handwriting noted, "Mum's winter coat that she wore for years. She bought us brand new coats from the department store because she didn't want us to face bullying at school about wearing obviously used clothing. Then she wore this single threadbare thrift store coat for 5 consecutive winters because we were growing so rapidly that buying her a new coat wasn't practically justifiable when that money could go toward our constant needs." Michael was still reading through tears when his office door opened without courtesy knock. Aurora and Luna entered purposefully and closed the door behind them, the lock clicking into place with finality. "Did you read it all?" Aurora asked, voice carefully neutral. Yes, most of it. I'm still—" Michael stood on shaky legs, reaching desperately for his checkbook with trembling hands. "I'll pay everything, right now, immediately, today. Whatever you need, whatever she needed, I'll write you a check for the full amount." "Stop." Luna's single word carried such absolute authority that Michael froze mid-reach. His hand hung suspended in air, reaching for the checkbook that represented such an easy, insufficient solution. "We don't want your money now," Aurora said, walking closer with measured steps. "We want you to genuinely understand what every single dollar on that comprehensive list actually represents in real human terms, not just numbers." She picked up the thick document with reverent care. "This entry right here. Medical bills from when I had severe pneumonia when I was 7 years old. Mum's health insurance didn't cover the specialist we desperately needed because of bureaucratic nonsense about approved provider networks. She worked triple shifts for 2 straight months, days, evenings, overnight, to pay for treatment in cash up front. I remember her coming home so bone-deep exhausted that she'd literally fall asleep standing up against the wall, still wearing her work clothes, too tired to even make it to her bedroom." Luna took the document, finding her marked page. "This one here. Professional art supplies for my middle school portfolio application to a competitive magnet program. High-quality materials I genuinely needed to be competitive against other applicants whose parents could afford the best. Mum ate nothing but rice and beans for 6 consecutive weeks so she could save enough money to buy me those supplies without going into debt. I didn't know about her sacrifice until years later when I found the grocery receipts she'd kept. 6 weeks of the cheapest food possible so I could have proper professional paintbrushes and quality canvas." They stood on either side of him, and Michael saw himself reflected in their intelligent faces, his bone structure, his expressions, his eyes looking back with judgment he absolutely deserved. "You want to write a check and make this entire situation disappear like it never happened," Aurora said, voice hard as stone. "You want to believe that money somehow fixes absence, that a bank transfer can erase abandonment. It doesn't work that way." But then something unexpected happened inside Michael. Instead of immediate capitulation, anger flared hot and irrational, defensive anger that surprised even him. "I didn't know you existed. How is any of that my fault? Your mother never told me she was pregnant, never reached out." The twins looked at him with something that might have been disappointment, but looked more like confirmation of something they'd already suspected about his character. "There it is," Aurora said quietly, almost sadly. "The defensiveness, the excuses, the victim mentality." "We wondered how long it would take," Luna added with the same disappointed tone. "How long before you stopped feeling guilty and started making yourself the victim in this story instead of taking responsibility?" Michael's irrational anger collapsed instantly into shame that hit him like cold water. They were absolutely right. He was already making excuses, already trying to escape responsibility, already rewriting the narrative to make himself less culpable. "Every single dollar on that list represents an actual choice our mother had to make," Luna said, her artistic voice painting vivid pictures. "A choice between her own needs and ours, between her long-deferred dreams and our immediate necessities, between paying for heat in winter or paying for unexpected hospital bills, between buying groceries for herself or buying required textbooks for our education." Aurora's voice grew even harder. more controlled. She chose us, every single time without exception, without hesitation, without resentment or complaint or making us feel guilty. She never once made us feel like we were too expensive or too difficult or too much trouble to handle alone. Because that's what real parents do, Luna finished, eyes glistening but no tears falling. They show up consistently for the boring parts, the expensive parts, the exhausting parts that don't make good stories, not just the highlight reel when it's convenient and visible. Michael felt something fundamental breaking inside his chest. I didn't know about any of this. If I had known you existed, you didn't want to know. Aurora's words were surgical, cutting straight through to infected tissue. You made one superficial attempt to find her, then gave up completely because searching was inconvenient and uncomfortable. You chose your guilt and shame over our existence, Luna said, voice finally showing deep emotion, anger that had been building for years. And now you want to throw money at us and feel absolved. Then why are you here? Michael asked, voice breaking. Why did you come to me with this document? They looked at each other with that profound twin communication. Then Aurora answered with brutal honesty. We're here to make you see exactly what you destroyed, what you casually threw away, what you decided wasn't worth the effort of searching for. We're here, Luna said softly but with conviction, because Mom taught us that people deserve to face the real consequences of their choices honestly. And your consequence is knowing exactly what you missed and can never get back. They turned to leave, movements synchronized, but Michael found his voice in the wreckage. Please, just tell me how to fix this. Aurora paused at the door. You can't fix 18 years of absence. You can't undo the nights Mom cried herself to sleep. You can't erase the Father's Day projects we made for her at school. You can't go back and be there when we were sick or scared. But if you genuinely want to start somewhere, Luna said, looking back, stop trying to claim the title of father. You haven't earned that. Start by just being a decent human being who shows up without expecting applause. They left, and Michael sat surrounded by 47 pages of itemized evidence of his complete failure, understanding that his daughters were exactly like their mother, brilliant, unforgiving, and completely uninterested in needing him. The document sat on his desk. He stared at it for hours as the sun moved across the sky. Then slowly he began to read every single page again from the beginning, not to defend himself, not to find excuses, just to understand what his absence had actually cost. Chapter 4. The Empire She Commands. The federal investigation began on Monday morning, exactly as Johanna had promised, with absolute confidence it would. Environmental Protection Agency officials arrived at Michael's corporate headquarters before most employees had finished their first coffee, carrying official legal warrants and bringing forensic accountants with government badges that turned his sleek, modern lobby into something resembling a crime scene. News crews were already camped strategically outside with cameras and satellite trucks, somehow tipped off in advance, broadcasting live footage of serious officials in windbreakers carrying boxes of documents to unmarked government vehicles. Michael's investors flooded every communication channel with increasingly panicked calls demanding immediate emergency meetings. His board of directors convened in crisis mode within an hour, expensive lawyers speaking in rapid-fire legal language about liability exposure and potential criminal charges, and Johanna held a devastating press conference where she systematically destroyed everything he'd built over the past decade. She stood before a wall of cameras and microphones with the absolute confidence of someone who'd anticipated every possible counterattack and prepared comprehensive responses for all of them. She looked powerful and professional in a deep blue suit, her locks styled elegantly, her bearing radiating natural authority. Simmons Development Corporation has spent significant time and money over the past years, lobbying aggressively to weaken environmental regulations at both state and federal levels, while simultaneously violating even the weakened standards that remain in effect. I have extensively documented evidence of falsified environmental impact studies, bribed government inspectors, offered money and gifts to overlook violations, and systematically manipulated scientific data across multiple major projects spanning several states and impacting thousands of acres of sensitive coastal ecosystem. A reporter shouted a question over the controlled chaos. Dr. Carolina. Some critics and supporters of Simmons' development are calling this a personal vendetta. Is it true that Michael Simmons is the biological father of your twin daughters? Johanna didn't flinch, didn't hesitate for even a fraction of a second. Michael Simmons' complicated relationship to my family is completely irrelevant to his company's systematic environmental crimes. I would pursue this case with exactly the same vigor, regardless of our personal history, because what his company has systematically done threatens fragile ecosystems that entire coastal communities depend on for their livelihoods. This isn't about revenge. This is about accountability for corporate environmental crime. But Michael, watching the press conference on television as federal investigators methodically photographed his files, knew better with absolute certainty. This was absolutely about revenge. Earned, calculated, comprehensive revenge. But it was also about the environment. Johanna cared about both. His lawyers presented him with options, none remotely good. Fight the charges vigorously and likely lose everything in protracted litigation. Settle quickly and admit guilt publicly, destroying his reputation forever. Declare immediate bankruptcy and abandon projects entirely. Then, late Tuesday afternoon, Johanna's architectural firm sent an official proposal via professional courier. Michael read the dense legal document 3 complete times, absolutely certain he was misunderstanding the terms. But no, she was offering him exactly one choice: surrender complete operational control of the resort expansion project to Carolina and Associates Environmental Design. Accept Johanna as lead architect and project director with final decision-making authority on absolutely all aspects. Publicly admit to specific environmental violations. Commit to comprehensive remediation at his expense. Submit to independent environmental oversight by her chosen auditors for all future projects for a decade, with her firm having absolute veto power. In exchange, she would personally recommend reduced federal penalties. The contract gave him no power, no control, no authority. He would be a figurehead, taking orders from the woman he'd abandoned. His legal team called it corporate suicide. Professional humiliation. Michael sat alone in his office as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. His advisors told him firmly to fight this, to refuse this humiliation, but he kept thinking about something. 6 months ago, he'd drafted an email requesting an independent environmental review of this exact project. He'd revised it multiple times. He'd never sent it because admitting doubt felt like admitting his father had been right to cut corners, that Michael had become exactly what he'd sworn he'd never be. He'd known, on some level, that his projects were causing real damage. He'd known and deliberately done nothing about it. Johanna was offering him what he'd been too weak to do himself: force real accountability. He thought about the document the twins had left, 47 pages detailing his absence. He thought about Johanna, nearly dying alone. He thought about the coastlines he'd damaged. At 11 that night, Michael did something he hadn't done in years. He drove to the construction site alone and walked the beach in the dark with just a flashlight, really looked carefully at what his preliminary work had already done: oil-contaminated sand stretching for yards, dead vegetation where there should have been thriving marsh grass, a poorly designed drainage system that had redirected natural water flow and killed an entire section of productive marsh. He'd approved all of this personally, signed off on it, told himself the environmental impact was exaggerated by activists. He sat on the beach until dawn broke golden over the ocean. When the sun rose, he understood something fundamental. Johanna wasn't punishing him out of spite. She was offering him a genuine chance to stop being the man he'd become. He signed all the papers at 8 a.m. and sent them by courier to her firm. Her response came at 9 via email, a single line without greeting or closing. Contract accepted and executed. Transition begins immediately this morning. Report to the project site at 8 a.m. tomorrow. You work for me now. Michael arrived at the construction site at 7:45, unwilling to give her even the small satisfaction of his tardiness. Johanna was already there, had probably been there since before dawn, surrounded by her impressive team, environmental scientists with advanced degrees, talented young architects, marine biologists, structural engineers, all of them brilliant and deeply committed and completely loyal to her vision. She saw him arrive and gestured dismissively toward a metal folding chair positioned in the corner of the temporary site office trailer. You can observe today's planning session. Don't interrupt our discussions unless directly asked a specific question. Don't offer suggestions unless explicitly requested. Just sit quietly and watch carefully and learn how development should actually work. For 8 brutally long hours, Michael sat in that uncomfortable folding chair and watched Johanna Carolina command her empire with breathtaking skill. She was absolutely extraordinary in action, decisive but never dictatorial, innovative while remaining practical, absolutely unwilling to compromise on core environmental principles, but remarkably flexible on implementation methods. She treated every team member with genuine respect, listened carefully to concerns, made complex decisions that balanced environmental protection with economic viability in ways that seemed almost magical. She'd become everything he'd only ever pretended to be. At day's end, Johanna finally addressed him directly. Tomorrow you'll start actual hands-on work, manual labor, site cleanup and remediation. We're systematically fixing the environmental damage your preliminary construction caused. You'll work alongside the remediation crew, doing whatever physical labor they need. I'll be there on time, Michael said quietly. I honestly don't care whether you're there or not, Johanna said, meeting his eyes for the first time all day. Your presence changes absolutely nothing for me or this project. This succeeds because of my team's excellence, not your participation. You're here because our legal contract requires it, not because I need you for anything whatsoever. She walked away without another word, leaving Michael sitting alone in that folding chair with crushing understanding that she'd stripped him of power and control, and she'd barely thought about him personally while efficiently doing it. He was completely irrelevant to her success, and somehow that realization hurt far more than everything else combined. Chapter 5. The Cost of Absence. Michael showed up at the remediation site at 6 a.m. the next day, 2 hours before the required start time. The remediation crew was already there, having started work at dawn. They looked at him with barely disguised contempt, the wealthy developer who'd destroyed their beloved coastline, now forced by court order and legal contract to help clean it up. "You're Michael Simmons?" The crew chief, a weathered man in his 50s named Benjamin, looked him up and down skeptically. "You know how to use a shovel properly?" "I'll learn whatever you need me to learn," Michael said quietly, meeting his gaze directly. For the next week, Michael did the hardest physical labor of his entire life, scrubbing oil from rocks with wire brushes until his hands bled and blistered, hauling contaminated sand in heavy buckets, replanting native vegetation in brutal sun. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. Every blister burst and formed again, layers of pain building. He didn't quit. He didn't complain. He just worked. The crew ignored him mostly, occasionally giving terse instructions without explanation. Michael didn't try to make friendly conversation or win them over with charm. He just worked silently, learning through observation and painful trial and error. On day 8, Benjamin handed him a bottle of water during a rare break. "You're still here." "I'll keep being here," Michael said simply, accepting the water gratefully. "Why?" Benjamin asked bluntly. "Court only mandated 40 hours of community service. You've done 60 already." Michael looked at the section of coastline they were slowly, painstakingly healing. "Because I broke this, and I need to understand on a physical level what breaking things actually costs, what it takes to heal what I damaged." Benjamin studied him for a long moment, weathered face unreadable. "Most rich guys send a big check and call it done. Feel like they've solved the problem without getting dirty. I tried that approach, Michael admitted honestly. Offered to pay my daughters everything I owed. They told me money doesn't fix absence or erase damage. They were right. That evening, exhausted and covered in sand and oil, Michael drove past the community centre Johanna had mentioned in an interview he'd read online. On impulse, he couldn't quite explain. He parked and went inside. Kids were everywhere, doing homework at crowded tables, participating in an art class, learning basic carpentry skills, playing basketball in the gym. He saw a flyer posted on the bulletin board. Volunteer tutors and mentors desperately needed. He took an application form. The news broke 2 weeks later, spreading rapidly across social media. Dr. Johanna Karolina, renowned environmental architect and sustainability advocate, had been offered the prestigious directorship of the European Union's Sustainable Development Initiative, based in Copenhagen, Denmark. Michael learned about this life-changing development through news alerts while hauling contaminated soil in the brutal afternoon sun. The detailed article featured glowing quotes from international environmental leaders enthusiastically praising Johanna's groundbreaking brilliance. It mentioned she'd be relocating permanently to Europe with her twin daughters. They were leaving, moving to another continent, permanently. Michael finished his work shift, went home, showered, and sat alone in the dark of his nearly empty apartment. Everything of value in his life had been systematically stripped away: his company, his reputation, his control, his pride. And now the only thing that actually mattered was moving 6,000 miles away. He didn't call Johanna, didn't go to her office, didn't try to use the twins as emotional leverage. Instead, he filled out the volunteer application form for the community centre, showed up the next evening to train as a tutor, started working with kids who reminded him painfully of what Aurora and Luna might have been like if Johanna hadn't fought so incredibly hard for them. He kept showing up at the remediation site every single day, kept working past his mandated hours without being asked. When reporters called requesting comment about Johanna's move to Europe, he said simply, "Dr. Karolina has built an extraordinary career through genuine dedication. This is an incredible opportunity for her. I hope she and her daughters find everything they're looking for in their new life." He didn't make it about himself, didn't beg or plead or make grand gestures. He just kept showing up consistently, to the coastline, to the community centre, to the therapy sessions he'd started attending twice weekly. Not because he expected forgiveness or reward, not because he thought Johanna was watching and would be impressed, just because it was finally, simply the right thing to do. Chapter 6. The Lesson in Humility. 3 months into the remediation work, something fundamental shifted in the dynamic. Benjamin, the crew chief, started actually talking to Michael beyond terse instructions, asking his opinion on replanting strategies, inviting him to join the crew for lunch breaks. "You're different than I expected," Benjamin said one day, both of them elbow-deep in marsh mud, carefully transplanting native grasses. "How so?" "Most developers, they show up for the photo opportunity, do an hour of carefully staged work, get their picture taken for social media and press releases, then leave and never come back. You've been here 3 months straight. No cameras, no press releases, no public credit, just work." Michael planted another native grass with the careful technique Benjamin had taught him. "I spent years systematically destroying places exactly like this and telling myself it was necessary for economic progress. I need to understand on a deep level what I actually destroyed, what it takes to heal the damage I caused." "You getting anything meaningful out of this?" Benjamin asked curiously. "Besides blisters and backache?" Michael considered the question with genuine honesty, perspective, humility, understanding that nature doesn't care about my quarterly earnings reports or my professional reputation. It just exists or doesn't exist based on the choices I make and the actions I take. At the community centre, Michael had settled into a comfortable routine. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, he tutored kids in math and basic business concepts. He was patient, encouraging, humble, everything he hadn't been in his corporate life when dealing with subordinates. One evening, a girl named Destiny asked him directly, "Why do you volunteer here? Don't you have a big important job somewhere?" "I used to," Michael said honestly. "I thought that job made me important and successful, but I was completely wrong about what importance actually means." "What does it mean?" Destiny asked, with genuine curiosity. Michael thought carefully about Johanna, working night shifts while nursing twins, sacrificing everything for her daughters. "It means showing up for people even when it's hard and unrewarding. It means making choices that help others, not just yourself. It means being there consistently and reliably, not just when it's convenient or when people are watching." He'd been volunteering for 6 weeks when Aurora and Luna walked into the community center unexpectedly. Michael was helping a young boy with fractions and didn't notice them at first. When he finally looked up, they were standing in the doorway, watching him work with quiet attention. He froze completely, chalk hovering over the small whiteboard. Aurora spoke first, her voice carefully neutral. "We've been watching you, for weeks." "Mum doesn't know we're here," Luna added quickly, almost apologetically. Michael set down the chalk with deliberate care, aware the boy was watching with open curiosity. "I won't tell her if you don't want me to." "That's your choice to make." "Why are you doing this?" Aurora gestured around the community center, encompassing the volunteering, the tutoring. "The remediation work that's way past your court mandate, the showing up day after day. Why?" Michael could have given them an easy answer designed to win approval. Could have said he was trying to earn their mother's forgiveness or their acceptance. Instead, he told them the unvarnished truth. "Because I spent 18 years building a corporate empire that systematically hurt people and places, and telling myself it didn't matter as long as I was financially successful and professionally respected. I was fundamentally wrong about everything that matters. This doesn't fix what I destroyed. It doesn't undo your mother going through pregnancy and childbirth alone. It doesn't give you back the father you deserved, but it's the only thing I know how to do now. Show up consistently and try to be genuinely useful to someone besides myself." The twins looked at each other with that profound, wordless communication. "We're not saying we forgive you for anything," Aurora said with absolute clarity. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Michael replied honestly. "I haven't earned that, and may never earn it." "But," Luna said softly, "we needed to see with our own eyes if this change was real and lasting. If you'd still be here doing this unglamorous work when no one was watching or keeping score or giving you credit." Michael met both their gazes steadily. "I'll be here, whether you want me here or not, whether your mother ever forgives me or not, whether anyone ever notices or cares. This is who I should have been all along, and I'm trying to become that person finally." Aurora studied him intently with those eyes so remarkably like his own. "Mum's seriously considering staying instead of going to Copenhagen. She won't admit it out loud to anyone, but she is." Michael's heart stopped completely. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because we need to know something important before we decide anything about our own relationship with you," Luna said carefully. "If she stays, if she gives you any chance at all, any opening whatsoever, will you run away again when things inevitably get hard and complicated?" "I can't prove that with words and promises," Michael said, understanding this was a test he couldn't afford to fail. "Words and promises are what I gave your mother before, and I broke every single one of them. All I can do is show up consistently, every single day, and let my sustained actions over time be my only answer." The twins studied him for a long, tense moment, then left without another word. Michael sat in the empty community center after they'd gone, understanding that his daughters had just given him something he absolutely didn't deserve, a chance to prove himself through consistent action rather than empty promises. Chapter 7. The Man Who Finally Listened. The hurricane warning came suddenly with little advance notice, forcing mandatory evacuations across the entire coastal region. Michael was at the remediation site when the emergency alert started screaming from every phone simultaneously, the piercing sound cutting through the usual sounds of work and waves. Benjamin shouted orders over the rising wind that was already bending trees at unnatural angles. Everyone to the designated shelter immediately. No exceptions. Move now. The designated emergency shelter was a reinforced community center about 15 miles inland, the same community center where Michael had been volunteering for weeks, teaching kids math and learning what it meant to show up consistently. Through the chaos of evacuation, traffic jams snarling every major road, closed routes forcing desperate detours, rapidly rising water making some streets impassable even to emergency vehicles, Michael ended up arriving at the shelter just as Johanna and the twins did. About 40 other people were also converging on the building, seeking safety from the approaching storm that forecasters were calling potentially catastrophic. Michael saw Johanna across the crowded parking lot as rain began falling in heavy sheets that immediately soaked through clothing. She saw him at the exact same moment. Neither acknowledged the other as they filed inside with everyone else, just two strangers seeking shelter from a common danger, nothing more. The community center filled quickly with anxious families, clutching emergency supplies. People claimed spaces along walls, spreading blankets and sleeping bags, trying to create small territories of safety. Emergency personnel distributed water and blankets and reassuring words that the building had been specifically reinforced for exactly this kind of event. The structure was solid, officially rated for Category 4 hurricanes. But as the storm intensified rapidly, the walls shook with each massive gust, and lights flickered ominously, making children cry and adults exchange worried glances. For the first few hours, Michael and Johanna stayed on opposite sides of the large room, carefully avoiding each other with the precision of people who were acutely aware of exactly where the other person was at all times. Michael helped emergency workers set up cots for elderly residents who couldn't sit on the floor. Johanna helped organize food supplies and calm frightened children with stories and games. The twins sat with a group of younger kids, telling elaborate tales to keep them distracted from the increasingly violent sounds outside. But as the storm grew violently worse and the lights flickered out entirely, plunging them into backup emergency lighting that cast eerie shadows, as people huddled together nervously and children whimpered in fear, Aurora made a decision that would change everything about their family's trajectory. She walked deliberately across the crowded shelter to where Michael sat against the wall, trying to make himself useful by comforting a scared family with young children. Luna followed her sister without hesitation, their movements synchronized as always. "We want to know the real story," Aurora said without preamble, her voice loud enough that nearby people turned to listen with open curiosity. "Not the sanitized version you tell yourself to sleep at night, not the excuses, the actual truth about what happened between you and Mom." Johanna approached immediately, drawn by her daughter's voices carrying across the shelter with unmistakable authority. "Girls, this really isn't the appropriate time for family drama." "When is the time, Mom?" Luna interrupted gently, but with absolute firmness. "We're trapped here together for potentially days. No more running from difficult conversations, no more avoiding the hard truths, just complete honesty for once." Other people in the shelter were openly listening now, the storm outside providing a strange kind of privacy through its constant roar. But the twins didn't care about the audience or the spectacle they were creating. Johanna looked at Michael for a long, searching moment, then at her daughter's determined faces that wouldn't accept deflection or delay. Finally, with visible reluctance and resignation, she sat down on the floor. "You want the real story without editing? Fine, but you might not like what you hear from either of us." She told them everything with brutal, unflinching honesty. The night in the abandoned beach house during another hurricane years ago that had brought two strangers together. Two people finding each other in chaos and violence and fear. The way they'd talked until dawn broke over the ocean about dreams and fears and hopes they'd never shared with anyone else. The promises they'd made when morning came and the storm had passed. "Your father said he'd find me," Johanna said, voice carefully controlled but emotion bleeding through. "He made me a promise that he'd come back within a week, that this wasn't just one night, that what we felt was real and worth pursuing." "I tried," Michael said quietly, needing them to know this fundamental truth. I know that doesn't excuse anything, but I need you to know. I genuinely tried with everything I had. My mother attempted suicide that first week. Not a threat or cry for attention. She actually took pills, ended up in the hospital having her stomach pumped. Then she tried again a few days later, seriously intending to die this time. The company was collapsing under massive debt we hadn't known about. I searched for you between crisis meetings, hired private investigators, called every hotel in that beach town, but you'd checked out and I only had your first name and a description. Johanna's face was carefully unreadable, but her eyes betrayed old pain. I went back to that beach house 3 separate times over 2 months. Left my contact information with every business in that entire town, hoping you'd come back looking. I know, I found out years later, far too late to matter. By the time my mother was stable and the company was barely functioning, I'd been searching for weeks with absolutely no success, and shame started working on me insidiously, whispering during sleepless nights that you'd moved on, that you were better off without my disaster of a life dragging you down. And then you stopped looking for me entirely, Johanna said flatly, not a question but a statement of fact. And then I stopped looking, Michael admitted, the shame as fresh and cutting as the day he'd given up the search. That's the complete unvarnished truth. I chose the easier pain, wondering what happened to you, building romantic fantasies, over the harder work of continuing to search indefinitely, with no guarantee of success. I'm not asking you to forgive that choice, I'm just telling you what actually happened. My turn to confess, Johanna said, voice tight with old pain. I found you eventually. 6 months pregnant, terrified, completely alone. I tracked you down to your new city, stood outside your office building in the cold. Michael's breath stopped completely, his heart seeming to freeze in his chest. I watched you through the window for probably an hour, maybe longer, Johanna continued, eyes distant with the vivid memory. You were laughing with colleagues, celebrating some business victory with champagne. You looked happy, successful, completely moved on with your life like that night had never happened, and I realized standing there pregnant and alone that showing up with babies you didn't choose would make you feel trapped, would make our daughters feel like burdens, ruining your second chance at success. You should have told me anyway, Michael said, voice breaking with emotion and regret. You should have given me the choice, let me decide. Maybe I should have, Johanna agreed quietly, honestly. But I was scared and alone and trying to make the best choice I could with the limited information I had, just like you were when you stopped searching for me. The twins sat in heavy, processing silence, their faces working through complex emotions. You both made choices based on fear, Aurora finally said, her voice carrying both disappointment and understanding. You're both still making choices based on fear right this moment. Luna looked at her mother with gentle perception beyond her years. You're considering not going to Copenhagen because you're afraid. We know, Mum. We've always known. Johanna started to deny it automatically, then physically stopped herself mid-breath. I'm afraid, she admitted to her daughters, to Michael, to the listening strangers in the shelter. I'm afraid of staying here and getting hurt again by the same man. I'm afraid of going to Europe and wondering forever what might have been if I'd been braver. I'm afraid that any choice I make will turn out to be the wrong one and I'll regret it forever. And you? Aurora turned her penetrating gaze to Michael. You're afraid to ask her to stay because you think you don't deserve to ask for anything after what you did. Michael nodded slowly, accepting the assessment. I don't deserve to ask her for anything. Maybe you don't deserve it, Luna said softly, thoughtfully. But maybe the real question isn't about deserving. Maybe it's about being honest about what you actually want, regardless of whether you deserve it or have earned it. The storm raged violently outside, wind screaming like something alive and furious. Inside, the shelter was quiet except for rain hammering relentlessly against the reinforced roof. Michael looked directly at Johanna, really looked at her. I can't ask you to stay. I don't have that right after what I did, after how I failed you. But I want you to know the truth. If I could go back and do it differently, I'd never stop searching until I found you. I'd search for years if that's what it took, every time, no matter what it cost me. You can't go back in time, Johanna said, voice thick with emotion. I know, but I can tell you the truth now, even if it changes nothing between us. I've spent 3 months doing manual labor, volunteering with kids, trying to become someone worth knowing, not to win you back, because I know that might never happen, but because I needed to understand what actually matters in life. And what matters is this. I love you. I loved you that night we spent together. I've loved you through all the years I tried desperately to forget you. I love the empire you built from nothing, and the daughters you raised alone, and the woman who's strong enough to destroy me when I deserved it. Tears ran down Johanna's face, the first time Michael had seen her cry, and it broke something in his chest. Love wasn't enough then. What makes it enough now? It isn't enough, Michael said with complete honesty. Love alone isn't enough and never was. But maybe love plus consistent action over time, plus honesty even when it hurts, plus time to build trust, plus real fundamental change in who I am, maybe all of that together could be enough. Not to erase the past, just to build something different in the future. The twins watched their parents with careful, hopeful attention. Johanna wiped her tears roughly with the back of her hand. I don't forgive you. I might never fully forgive you for what you put me through alone. I understand completely, Michael said, accepting this truth without argument. But, Johanna continued, her voice shaking with vulnerability, I'm starting to think that maybe we both deserve a chance to see who we could be if we stopped letting fear and shame make all our choices for us. The storm raged on outside with undiminished fury. No easy resolution appeared. No declarations magically solved everything. Just 4 people sitting together with the crushing weight of choices made in fear and pain and desperation. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like the beginning of something honest and real. Chapter 8. The Truth About That Night. After the storm finally passed and the sun emerged, Aurora and Luna made an announcement that shocked both parents completely. They weren't going to Copenhagen with their mother, and they weren't staying in America with their father either. Both twins had decided independently to take gap years before university, traveling separately to different continents to find themselves outside their parents' complicated story and shadow. Aurora had deferred her prestigious university admission to work with a medical technology non-profit in Southeast Asia, developing affordable prosthetics. Luna had secured an artist residency in South America, exploring themes of identity and belonging. They'd be gone for a full year, maybe longer. We're exhausted by being symbols, Aurora said firmly when both parents tried to object. Symbols of Mom's strength and sacrifice, symbols of your failure and absence. We want to be ourselves, just ourselves, not characters in your story. Before they left, they made clear demands of both parents. To Johanna, stop running from difficult things. Stop making major life decisions based on fear of him hurting you again. Stay in America or go to Copenhagen, but do it because it's what you genuinely want for your own life, not because you're afraid of being vulnerable. To Michael, stop performing redemption for an audience. We don't need grand gestures or dramatic transformations. We need to know that if we come back in a year and you're still here, you'll be someone we actually want to know, not because you're technically our father, but because you're a genuinely good person. Don't contact us unless it's an actual emergency, they said to both parents with finality. Don't wait for us or put your lives on hold. Don't make your choices about us. When we come back, we'll decide if we want you in our lives, together or separately or not at all, but you don't get to use us as an excuse for your choices anymore. They left within a week, both parents devastated by the sudden absence, but for the first time, they couldn't hide behind their daughters or use them as buffers against each other. Johanna made her decision about Copenhagen alone at 3 in the morning, sitting in her apartment. She turned it down definitively. Not for Michael, not because of fear of him, but because she realized that running to Europe was itself a fear-based choice. She'd built something meaningful here, a community that valued her, a career that mattered, a life she'd created from nothing. The Copenhagen offer was incredible, but it was also an escape from dealing with her feelings. She stayed because she wanted to stay. Accepted a tenured university position, kept her thriving consulting work, remained embedded in the community she'd built over years. Michael learned this through the news, not from her directly. She didn't tell him because this choice had nothing to do with him. He continued showing up to his commitments without change. The remediation site, the community center, therapy twice weekly. He didn't reach out to Johanna, didn't try to force contact or manufacture encounters. He just kept doing the hard work of becoming someone different from who he'd been. 2 months after the twins left, Johanna came to the remediation site unexpectedly. Michael was waist-deep in marsh water, carefully transplanting native grasses with the technique Benjamin had taught him when he saw her standing on the shore watching him work. He waded out, covered in mud and salt water. "Johanna, Benjamin told me you're here almost every day," she said, studying him with unreadable eyes. "Even though your court mandate expired weeks ago." "The work isn't finished," Michael said simply, gesturing at the marsh. "There's still damage to repair." "Why are you really doing this?" Johanna asked bluntly. "Tell me the truth." Michael looked at the marsh they were slowly, painstakingly bringing back to life. "Because I need to understand on a physical, visceral level that my choices have real, lasting consequences. Every plant I put back in this marsh is one small thing I destroyed being given a chance to live again. It doesn't undo the damage I caused, but it's the only thing I know how to do that actually means something." Johanna studied him for a long, searching moment. "The Michael I knew years ago would never have done this kind of work. He would have written a check and moved on to the next thing." "The Michael you knew was a coward," he said quietly, without self-pity. "I'm trying to be someone else now." "Are you doing this to win me back?" Johanna asked with characteristic directness. "No," Michael said, and meant it completely. "I'm doing this because it's right, because I should have been doing work like this all along, regardless of whether you existed or not. You exposed what I was, someone who destroyed things for profit and convinced myself it was justified. I can't go back and undo that, but I can try to be fundamentally different going forward." Johanna's expression was unreadable. "I'm staying in the area. I turned down Copenhagen." "I know. I saw the announcement." "I didn't stay for you," she said, watching him carefully for reaction. "I know that too," Michael replied honestly. "You stayed because you wanted to stay, because this is where you've built your life. That's how it should be." They stood in awkward silence, the sound of waves filling the space between them. "Would you want to get coffee sometime?" Johanna asked suddenly, surprising both of them. "To talk about the twins when they send updates, or the remediation project, or nothing important?" Michael's heart stopped completely. "Just coffee?" "Just coffee," Johanna confirmed firmly. "Nothing more than that, no expectations." "I'd like that very much," Michael said quietly. They had coffee the following week at a neutral cafe neither frequented. It was stilted and strange, and occasionally awkward. They talked about Aurora's emails from Southeast Asia, about Luna's artwork from South America, about the marsh restoration techniques, about the community center programs. They didn't talk about that night. They didn't talk about feelings or the future or what they might become, but it was a genuine start at something. Chapter 9. The Daughters Who Decide. 11 months later, Aurora and Luna returned home unannounced, tanned and confident, and fundamentally transformed. They found their mother having coffee with their father at the same neutral cafe, not romantically, not as a couple, just two people who'd been through war together, learning to exist peacefully in the same space. The twins had changed profoundly during their time away. More confident, more certain of themselves and their own identities, less defined by their parents' complicated history. Over hours of intense conversation, they shared their transformative experiences. Aurora had helped design affordable prosthetics for children in resource-limited communities, work that had given her purpose beyond her parents' story. Luna had created a powerful public art installation about displacement and belonging that had been featured in international galleries and won significant awards. They'd found themselves completely separate from their origin story. Now they had pointed questions for both parents. "Have you two been seeing each other?" Aurora asked with characteristic directness. "We have coffee regularly," Johanna said carefully, measuring her words. "We're learning to be civil and respectful. We're co-parenting even though you're adults now." Michael added quietly, "We're taking it extremely slowly, very deliberately." "Do you love each other?" Aurora asked, cutting straight to the emotional heart. Johanna and Michael looked at each other with complicated expressions neither could quite read. "I don't know, honestly," Johanna admitted with vulnerability. "I know I loved who he was that night years ago. I know I hated who he became when he disappeared. I'm learning who he is now, and I genuinely don't know what I feel about that person yet." "I love her," Michael said with simple honesty. "I loved her that night. I've loved her through all the years I tried desperately not to think about her. But love isn't enough if she can't trust me. And I haven't earned that trust yet and may never earn it." The twins were quiet, processing carefully. "We're going to university now," Aurora said finally. "Luna's staying local. I'm going across the country. We want both of you actively in our lives, as parents, not as a couple. We honestly don't care if you ever get together romantically. We care that you're both finally real people instead of symbols or cautionary tales." "We spent the year learning to stand completely on our own," Luna added thoughtfully. "Now you need to figure out who you are, separately and possibly together. We're not your excuse anymore. We're not your motivation or your shield. We're just your daughters, and we want parents who are whole people." Over the following months, Michael and Johanna continued their careful, deliberate dance. Coffee became occasional walks on the beach. Walks became collaboration on community environmental projects. Working together became Michael showing up when Johanna's car broke down, Johanna recommending Michael for speaking engagements about corporate accountability and genuine redemption. Nothing romantic happened between them. Just two people slowly, painfully learning to trust small moments and honest conversations. The twins watched from a healthy distance, building their own independent lives and identities, checking in occasionally, but no longer mediating or managing. "Think they'll ever figure it out?" Aurora asked Luna one day over lunch. "They already are figuring it out," Luna said wisely. "Just very slowly and carefully, which is probably exactly what they need." Chapter 10. The Family They Choose to Build. One evening, after a particularly successful community environmental project launch, a restored wetland that would serve as an educational center for decades, Johanna asked Michael quietly if he wanted to walk on the beach where they'd originally met all those years ago during the hurricane that had changed everything. They walked in comfortable silence for a long time, waves washing rhythmically over their feet, the sand cool and firm beneath them, until Johanna finally spoke the words she'd been holding inside for months. "I don't forgive you," she said quietly, but with absolute clarity, stopping to face the ocean. "I might never fully forgive you for what you put me through alone. The pregnancy, the birth, the terror, the exhaustion, all of it." Michael nodded slowly, accepting this truth without argument or defensiveness. "I understand completely, and I don't expect forgiveness." "But," Johanna continued, turning to face him directly in the fading golden light, "I'm starting to understand that night wasn't a lie or a mistake or something to regret. That maybe we both deserved better than what fear and shame made us choose in the aftermath." "I don't need your forgiveness," Michael said with complete honesty, meeting her eyes. "I just need you to know that if I could go back in time with what I know now, I'd search until I found you. Every single time, no matter what it cost me personally or professionally, no matter how long it took or how many dead ends I hit." Johanna looked at him carefully in the fading light, the setting sun painting her face in warm colors. "Then prove it now, in the present. Don't search for who we were back then during that storm. That's gone and can't be recovered. Help me build who we could actually be now with everything we've learned and survived." Michael carefully, tentatively took her hand, giving her every possible chance to pull away, to reject this small gesture. She didn't pull away. Her fingers tightened around his. Time passed in its steady, inexorable way. Seasons changed with reliable rhythm. The twins graduated with honors, Aurora with a prestigious degree in biomedical engineering and multiple job offers from top companies. Luna with a gallery show launching her professional artistic career to critical acclaim and commercial success. Both parents attended everything together, sitting side by side, cheering loudly, taking countless photographs, being present in ways they'd learned to value. The community center thrived and expanded with their combined support and vision. Johanna's architectural firm grew strategically with Michael in a genuine supporting role he'd learned to embrace rather than resent. They had dinner together weekly, sometimes with the twins when they were in town, sometimes alone when the twins were busy building their own independent lives. They talked about everything and nothing, childhoods they'd survived, fears they still carried, dreams they'd abandoned and new ones they were building, mistakes they'd made and lessons they'd learned. They went to therapy, separately with their own counselors and occasionally together with a couples therapist, even though they weren't technically a couple yet. And slowly, carefully, deliberately, they built something neither had adequate words for yet. Something that defied easy categorization, not the passionate storm of their first night together, that desperate connection of two wounded people seeking shelter. This was something more complex and real and sustainable, partnership built on daily honesty instead of romantic fantasy, respect earned through consistent action rather than promised with pretty words. A full year after that meaningful beach walk at Aurora's graduate school acceptance celebration at a restaurant the twins had chosen, someone asked casually if Johanna and Michael were together as a couple. "We're figuring it out day by day," Johanna said with a small smile, and Michael smiled too because that was the absolute truth without embellishment. They were figuring it out carefully and deliberately. One genuinely honest moment at a time, one difficult conversation after another, one choice to show up when it would be easier to run. 2 years after Johanna's keynote speech that had destroyed his empire, Michael proposed to her on the beach where they'd first met, where they'd sheltered from the hurricane together. He didn't have a ring, didn't plan an elaborate scene, just asked honestly if she'd be willing to build something permanent with him, knowing all his failures, carrying all their complicated history. "Ask me again in 6 months, Johanna said seriously, not rejecting but not accepting either. "I need to be absolutely certain this isn't momentum or guilt or trying to create the family we think we should have been. I need to be certain this is what we both genuinely want for ourselves." Michael nodded, accepting this boundary with grace he'd learned through hard experience. "I'll ask again in 6 months if you want me to." 6 months later, on the anniversary of that first proposal, Johanna said yes before he could even ask the question again. They married quietly, with just the twins and a handful of close friends. No elaborate ceremony, no expensive production, just honest vows they'd written themselves about showing up consistently, about choosing each other daily, about building something real instead of performing something perfect. Aurora stood beside her mother. Luna stood beside their father. Both twins cried happy tears, finally seeing their parents choose each other consciously rather than being trapped by circumstance or guilt. "I never thought I'd see this," Aurora whispered to Luna during the simple reception. "They had to become completely different people first," Luna whispered back wisely. "The people they were when they met couldn't have built this. They needed to break and rebuild themselves separately before they could build something together." The years that followed weren't perfect or easy. Johanna and Michael fought sometimes, disagreed frequently, struggled with old wounds that surfaced unexpectedly. But they'd learned to fight fairly, to disagree without contempt, to acknowledge wounds without weaponizing them. They built a life together that honored what they'd survived separately. Michael never stopped doing remediation work, even after the legal requirements ended. It became part of who he was, spending every Saturday morning at various environmental restoration sites, teaching young people about corporate responsibility and environmental stewardship. Johanna's firm became internationally recognized for sustainable development that actually worked. She gave keynote speeches around the world, always crediting the community that had supported her, never forgetting where she'd started. The twins built their own remarkable lives. Aurora developing medical technology that saved lives in underserved communities. Luna creating art that challenged people to think differently about belonging and identity. They remained close to both parents, but healthily independent, their own people rather than symbols of their parents' redemption. Some love stories end cleanly with perfect resolution. Some begin perfectly with love at first sight. And some do both simultaneously, in the complicated space between what was lost forever and what might still be found and carefully built. Michael and Johanna were learning to live fully in that complex space, building a family not from obligation or guilt or trying to recover what they'd lost, but from daily conscious choice, choosing each day to show up honestly, to be vulnerable, to try again. On their 5th wedding anniversary, sitting on the beach where everything had begun and ended and begun again, Johanna said something that surprised Michael. "I forgive you," she said quietly, watching the waves. "I've forgiven you. I don't know exactly when it happened. It wasn't a single moment but a gradual letting go, but I forgive you for not finding me, for giving up, for all of it." Michael felt tears on his face. "I don't deserve that forgiveness." "Probably not," Johanna agreed with characteristic honesty, taking his hand. "But I'm giving it anyway, not because you've earned it by some objective measure, but because holding on to that anger was keeping me from being fully present in what we're building now." They sat together as the sun set, two people who'd found each other twice, once in a storm, once in its aftermath, and had finally learned that love wasn't about deserving or earning, but about choosing consistently to show up, be honest, and try. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything they'd needed to find. The family they built wasn't the one they'd lost all those years ago in fear and shame. It was better, built on truth instead of fantasy, on daily choice instead of passionate promises, on showing up for the boring parts instead of just the highlight reel. And somehow, impossibly, that made all the pain and loss and years of separation worth surviving, because they'd become people worthy of the love they'd always wanted, together.